There is a number sitting somewhere in a spreadsheet right now. Your number. Maybe you check it monthly, maybe weekly, maybe more than you'd like to admit. And no matter what it says, something about it never quite feels like enough. That feeling has a name, but it isn't greed. It isn't anxiety exactly. It's the sense that you are standing just outside a door you can almost see but can't quite locate. Here is what nobody tells you. Wealth doesn't change your life in a straight line. It changes in jumps. Quiet structural jumps. Where one day, a decision you used to agonize over simply stops mattering, and then another, and then another. Most people spend their entire lives optimizing inside one level, never realizing the next level operates by completely different rules. There are three of those levels. Three net worth thresholds where something real and irreversible shifts. Not in what you own, in how you live. This is what those thresholds actually look like. And what happens to you when you cross them? Let's start with a feeling most people know but rarely name. It is Sunday evening. You are not at work. You are not doing anything particularly stressful. But somewhere in your chest, there is a low, constant hum. Not panic, just presence. Money is always in the room. Every decision carries a financial shadow. The dinner out, the car repair, the flight home for a holiday. You run the numbers automatically, reflexively, before you even decide whether you want to do the thing. This is what financial stress actually feels like for most people. Not crisis, just constant low-level vigilance. 72% of Americans cite money as a significant source of stress. That is not 72% of struggling people. That is 72% of everyone, including people earning six figures, including people with good jobs and 401k plans and sensible budgets. One reason that number stays so stubbornly high is a specific vulnerability almost everyone carries, regardless of income. The Federal Reserve found that 37% of Americans could not cover an unexpected $400 expense in cash. $400, not 4,000. The first threshold is about making that vulnerability disappear, not just once, permanently. The structural target is a liquid emergency fund of 3 to 6 months of actual living expenses, held in cash or near cash, completely separate from your investments. This sounds almost insultingly simple, and yet for most households, it is the single most transformative financial change they will ever make. Right now, every unexpected expense in your life is a decision problem. The car breaks down. Do you put it on the card, pull from savings, delay something else? Those decisions are draining, not because they're hard, but because they're constant. Once you have a full emergency buffer, that category of decision essentially ceases to exist. The car breaks down. You fix the car. There is no spiral, no trade-off, no Sunday night hum. But an emergency fund alone does not reach the first threshold. When you have no buffer and no savings, your job is survival infrastructure. You cannot afford to lose it. Not really, not without serious disruption, which means you absorb things at work you might not otherwise accept. A bad manager, a culture that drains you, a role that stopped growing 2 years ago. With zero runway, you stay. With a growing financial cushion, even a modest one, you begin to feel for the first time that you are choosing to be there. That distinction is not trivial. It is the beginning of agency. Here's the thing about the first threshold that surprises most people when they cross it. The relief isn't primarily financial, it's cognitive. Financial stress consumes significant mental bandwidth, the kind of background processing that could otherwise go toward creativity, relationships, long-term planning. When the buffer exists and the savings are growing, that bandwidth becomes available again. You start thinking differently, not because you are smarter, because you are less encumbered. The first threshold is not about being rich. It is about reaching the point where money stops being the first filter on every decision you make. For most households spending between $40,000 and $70,000 a year, the first threshold sits somewhere between $50,000 and $150,000 in net worth, with a fully funded emergency reserve, no high interest debt, and a clear trajectory of growing assets. The shift isn't about a precise number, it's about the structural position. The median net worth for households aged 35 to 44 is $135,000, which sounds meaningful until you realize much of that is tied up in home equity that cannot be spent in an emergency. The number of households who have truly reached this first threshold, liquid, debt light with growing assets, is smaller than the headline figures suggest. The second threshold is different in kind, not just in degree, and the gap between the first and second is the longest stretch of the journey. This is where most financially aware people spend most of their adult lives, building, saving, compounding, aiming at a destination they can calculate but not yet feel. The second threshold has a name in financial independence circles. It is sometimes called the crossover point. The crossover point is the moment when your investment portfolio generates enough in annual returns to cover your annual expenses, so that, in theory, you no longer need to trade your time for money to sustain your life. The framework most often used to locate this crossover point comes from a study at Trinity University. The finding, now widely known as the 4% rule, is this. If you withdraw 4% of your investment portfolio each year, there is a very high probability your portfolio will last 30 years without running out. The 4% rule gives you a precise target. To be financially independent, you need 25 times your annual expenses saved and invested. If you spend $50,000 a year, your target is $1.25 million. The number feels large, but the mechanism is elegant. This is the moment where people tend to do one of two things. Either they feel a surge of motivation, the goal is real, it is specific, it is achievable, or they feel quietly defeated by the size of the number and quietly move on. If you have felt the second reaction, it is worth understanding something about compound growth. The journey to the second threshold is not linear. The first few years of serious saving feel slow, almost discouraging. But the math of compounding means the final years before you cross the threshold accelerate dramatically. The portfolio starts doing the heavy lifting before you reach independence. The crossing just makes it official. Here's what actually changes at the second threshold. Not the lifestyle, at least not necessarily. What changes is the nature of work itself. Before this point, work is something you must do. After this point, even if you continue doing exactly the same work, you are choosing to do it. That is not a small thing. Research on autonomy and well-being consistently shows that perceived control over your time is one of the strongest predictors of life satisfaction. When work becomes voluntary, it often becomes more tolerable. Sometimes it becomes something you love in a way you never quite could before, because the resentment is gone. What's left is whatever was always real about it. Reaching the crossover point does not mean you have unlimited money. It means you have enough, defined precisely as enough to sustain your current lifestyle indefinitely without additional labor income. Level 2, financial independence is not wealth in the sense most people imagine it. It is sufficiency made permanent. Americans say they need, on average, $2.2 million to feel truly wealthy. They say they need $774,000 to feel comfortable. But the actual crossover point for someone spending $60,000 a year is $1.5 million, a number that belongs fully to neither feeling. That gap between the math and the feeling is exactly where hedonic adaptation lives. This is the psychological tendency to return to a baseline level of satisfaction no matter what changes in your circumstances. You expected crossing this threshold to feel different. It does feel different, but not as different as you imagined, which is precisely where the third threshold enters the picture. The third level is the one that is hardest to define and easiest to misunderstand, because the popular image of it is almost entirely wrong. People tend to picture the third level as luxury, yachts, second homes, art collections. But the actual structural shift at level 3 has nothing to do with what you spend. It has to do with the rate at which wealth generates more wealth. The third threshold is the point where capital gains and investment income consistently exceed not just your expenses, but your capacity to spend. Your portfolio is growing faster than your lifestyle can consume it. At this level, you are no longer managing a portfolio. You are managing a system that is, in a very real sense, managing itself. And the relationship with money changes in a way that is almost philosophical. Scarcity, even as a theoretical possibility, effectively disappears. For most people in most market environments, the third threshold sits somewhere above $5 million in invested assets, and more commonly above 8 to 10 million. This is not a level reached through saving alone. Saving, even aggressive saving, has a ceiling. The people who reach level 3 typically get there through one or a few high asymmetry events: a business exit, equity that scaled, or real estate that compounded over decades. To be in the top 1% of American households by net worth in 2022, you needed approximately $11.1 million. The top 10% threshold, the entry point to the top tenth of all households, was 1.03 million. That gap between 10% and 1% is not a step. It is a wall. A landmark study found that for most people, emotional well-being continues rising with income well above what earlier research suggested, but with a meaningful exception. For people who were already unhappy at lower incomes, happiness tended to plateau around $100,000 a year. More money beyond that point didn't fix what wasn't a money problem. The thresholds matter, but they are not magic. They change your circumstances. They do not change you. What you now know, that most people don't, is that there isn't one door. There are three, and they open onto different rooms, not the same room with better furniture. The first room removes the hum, that low background vigilance that follows you through Sunday evenings and dinner conversations and small decisions that shouldn't be hard. The second room removes the clock, the one that was always measuring how much longer you have to trade your time before you've earned the right to stop. The third room is different in kind from both. But the deepest truth of this map is not about the third room. It is about what it means to finally, actually, locate the door in front of you. To know exactly what crossing it would change and what it wouldn't. That knowledge is not small. Most people never have it. You do now.